everything we've been talking about so far. They are material evidence of document-based bureaucracy, which is a technology, of course, originally imported from China. But usually in the Japanese context, we talk about that import, of course, coming through the intermediary of the Korean Peninsula, primarily from the Kingdom of Baekje, which had very close ties to Japan, but to a lesser extent from Shilla. And in my research, and I like to stress that we have a rapid expansion of, and I'm forgetting to change slides here, but for those of you who are not familiar, which at this point you probably all are, Japan had very close ties with Baekje, but also had relations with Shilla, particularly during what I'm going to refer to as the proto-historic period, but archaeologically is also called the Kobun period, from about the mid-3rd century to 645 CE and the Taika reform. Now, so we talk about writing and bureaucracy, and Mokkan is something that really picks up, really expands in the latter half of the 7th century, but I want to stress that it's not as if no one knew how to write in Japan before that. We know that there were scribal lineages, but many of them that were descendant from immigrants from the Korean Peninsula that were in Japan and producing documents during the so-called proto-historic period. But when we want to talk about the expansion of writing as a technology, of the underpinning of a bureaucracy, that is a phenomenon of the latter half of the 7th century. So I'm going to talk about what Mokkan from that period looked like. And in this context, again, I don't really have time for this, but the Battle of the Paek River, which marks the end of the Baekje Kingdom in 663, is a really important watershed moment because it's at that point you get a massive influx of literate immigrants from Baekje coming into Japan and taking part in expanding the bureaucracy. So we talked about 645 as this so-called Taika reform of trying to get a Chinese-style bureaucracy off the ground in Japan, but it doesn't really have the human resources to move forward until you get this big influx of literate people from Baekje, and that's when things really explode. And in terms of Mokkan numbers, it's the last quarter of the 7th century where things really pick up. So I think I have that on the next slide here. So Mokkan in Japan, as compared to Korea, there's a lot of them. You usually hear a number of around 400,000. Now, 320,000 of those are from the early historic period. And when I say early historic period, I mean that late 7th century through the 9th century or so, the beginning of the Heian period. Now, about 200,000 or more of those are from the Heijo Palace site, which is the Nara Palace in modern Nara City. So it's heavily skewed toward artifacts from that site. That site had really unique preservation conditions. That's part of why we get so many. But it's also, of course, the center of a massive bureaucracy operating throughout the 8th century. So about 2/3 of that 320,000 number alone coming from the Heijo Palace site. In terms of 7th century Mokkan, we've got about 45,000. Now, we've only got about 100 from the 640s to the 660s. So that's kind of the incipient period, you could say, right? And then everything else kind of comes from in between the years 675 and 710, which for my purposes I include up until the establishment of the Nara capital in 710 as part of the 7th century. So within that, 99% or so are from the capital again. But we've got about 300 or so Mokkan that come from sites outside of the capital region, and those are what I've been focused on lately, so I'm going to kind of give probably undue attention to them now, but I think it's really interesting to think about where Mokkan are coming from in the 7th century and why. That's sort of the question that I've been trying to answer. Let me show you a map here. So again, the Fujiwara Palace, Fujiwara capital site, that's 30,000 right there. That's the majority. We also have a number of sites in Asuka, which is to the south of the Fujiwara capital. It's another 14,000 or so. The Naniwa Palace site, which is in modern Osaka, that has about 60. Very briefly, the capital, right after the Taika reform through 652. Actually, among those, we have the earliest Mokkan with the sexagenary date in the Japanese context, dated 648, so it's pretty, dating there. It's pretty clear that it's from the period of the capital. There is, in this context, what's known as the Omi capital as well, which is the capital actually pretty significantly right after, or pretty soon after the Battle of the Peck River, where we only have 2 mokkan that could potentially be dated to that period, but they're also really interesting and probably won't have time, but I do have slides in them. You can ask me about it later. Those provincial sites, it's, so the number that I just cited from Yamamoto Takashi, these are my own numbers here. 300 is a little bit high by my count, but I decided to match it up with his. But in terms of sites that have significant deposits, so you get like 1 or 2 from a lot of these other sites, but anything that has more than 8, I've sort of highlighted on here as sort of the main sites that I'm looking at. I hope I have, no I don't, they're not, it must be further along. But in Tokushima Prefecture, the Kanonji site, which has come up already today, I believe in Professor Kuhn's presentation at the beginning. Several sites in the Omi region, modern-day Shiga Prefecture around Lake Biwa, the Iba site in modern Hamamatsu, Shizuoka. I forgot my other pointer, I am so sorry. And Yashiro, which is in Nagano Prefecture, and then Kochigiba, which is in Saitama Prefecture. So you can see they're pretty scattered around. And my question in looking at this map is, okay, so you get these significant mokkan deposits in these places that are very far away from each other. Why are you getting them in these specific places? And I didn't bring a watch up here with me, so please let me know. Okay. So just briefly to kind of talk about in general what distinguishes 7th century mokkan from 8th century mokkan other than numbers is well, mass production is definitely a feature of 8th century mokkan. That's part of why we get so many of them. 7th century mokkan tend to be more singular pieces. 7th century mokkan, we definitely have some nifuda, some tags, but in the 8th century, it's by far the majority of what we have. We have particularly identifiable document formats such as the Zenpaku format that I referred to before, prominent in the 7th century. By the 8th century, those document formats have been brought into line with Chinese standards. It's thought that the Zenpaku format is more based on Korean practices. And in accordance with the 4th point on here, that character usage, certain things like the use of this character here for Kura, this character for 40, that these are, again, based on practices on the Korean Peninsula. And then in terms of transcribing vernacular language, the use of this as a locative particle, the use of this as a sentence final particle, these are all practices you find very commonly in Korean inscriptions. And mostly disappear, again, in the 8th century as things are kind of brought up to Chinese standards. So you see a correction from this character to this or this, a correction from this character to this. We get a lot of vernacularized prose style, 7th century mokkan, whereas the 8th century mokkan, again, in accordance with this point and the point before, try to look more Chinese in practice. Let's see if I can get to the point here. Okay, I've already mentioned that. So the kind of 2 theories that I suppose I've already mentioned in some ways that I want to kind of put forward about 7th century mokkan. Well, the first one I think is something that most people agree on, right? Again, that the importance of Baekje immigrants in kind of getting Korean culture off the ground in late 7th century Japan. But then with regards specifically to these 7th century mokkan that are found outside the capital, one of the things that I found really interesting is that basically all of these important sites, and probably it's better to look at them on a map, so maybe that's why I had this here. Basically every single one of these sites, there's a bunch of sites here in the Omi region in Yasu. One, they're oftentimes along important transit routes, both sea and water routes. And then 2, there's usually, the biggest and earliest kofun, the biggest and earliest settlement site in the region right there, right? So I noticed this pattern in kind of looking at these different sites is that basically the local leaders of these areas had a long relationship with those in the Yamato center, right, the Yamato rulers, and Their adoption of writing, early adoption of writing, is that also another manifestation of this? Can we not look at late 7th century Mokkan as belonging both to the beginning of the Ritsuryo, right, beginning of the historic period, but also the end of the proto-historic period? Now, I know that this is maybe an idea that not a lot of people will like, but I think there's something to think about here, because clearly, I think the best example here, if I skip forward, is this one here. So this is a very famous Mokkan that has a piece of text on it that is very easily read as Japanese. Now, I say that, but the characters that are being read in Japanese are being glossed in Japanese, right? They are not phonograms, but they are semantograms, if you understand that distinction. But it's very easy to read this out as, this character is probably atai, kura no atai, tsudaeshi, ware, mochi yuku, ine wa uma ezu shite, yue ni ware wa kaeri koshi, right? It's very easy if you know how to do that, right? If you know how to do the kuntoku style reading. And what this suggests is that, 7th century communication, one, this is a pretty unique text. There's a few other comparable examples, but this isn't very common. But it suggests that 7th century communication, when we're still dealing with in a context of not everybody can read and write, maybe some people can, some people can't, some people have half of an education, that kind of thing, that this kind of writing that is easily glossed into the vernacular, right, is more immediate, that there's a certain utility to that, a usefulness to that in that transitional moment, right, that transition from proto-historic to early historic period. And again, this sort of writing too, because the characters that are being glossed in the vernacular are semantograms, this looks a lot like, a couple texts that Professor Kim mentioned from Hama and Sonsan Fortress that have this kind of same style of writing, particularly the use of this is a final particle, and the use of space. Right, the use of space as punctuation. So these kind of features, one, have precedence in the Korean Peninsula. Two, this is again useful in the context of limited literacy and useful for the purpose of direct, lucid, immediate communication. And the other thing about this Mokkan is the people who are mentioned. Kura no atari, Tama no Kubito. These are both branches, or these are two lineages that belong to a larger lineage group known as the Shiga no Ayakuto, which is a originally descended from peninsular immigrants' scribal lineage, right? And probably controlled the transit network around this area in the late 7th century. So there is an implication there that the people involved in this piece of communication are not centrally appointed officials, right? And I think that's really important because there's this idea that writing and bureaucracy is necessarily imposed from the center onto the periphery. I'm not saying the center is not involved at all here, but the people involved in this particular exchange aren't necessarily being appointed from the center. So is there not room to think about, as I was saying again, these kind of texts, these very early Mokkan texts in the context of that late proto-historic transition into the early historic period? And I probably don't have time to say any more than that, so I will stop.